Cyberpunk's patch 2.2 added 10 new cars to the game, as well as a ton more customizability with expanded crystal coat twin-tone options. There's a hell of a lot more to factor in now when it comes to selecting the best vehicles in the game. So I figure now is the perfect time to release one ultimate comprehensive ranking video for every single car and bike we can own in Cyberpunk 2077, determining once and for all which is best. Again, assessing speed, acceleration, power, toughness, style, visibility, twin tones, basically everything. It's gonna be a big one, Tooms, so sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Maintaining its spot as Cyberpunk's worst car is a vehicle that was always designed to be so. At 13k, the Thorton Galena G240 is certainly an affordable early car, but that's about it. Released 46 years ago back in 2031, the Galena was the affordable answer to the masses needing to own their own vehicle. It's notably driven in Edge Runners by David Martinez's mother Gloria to illustrate that the family are poor, and the model we can own hasn't even been driven in 10 years because the guy who owned it was ultra paranoid, staying inside afraid of getting zeroed, until one day a stray bullet caught him through his window anyway. Amoral, Reyes says that we need to grab life by the balls and buy this car, for some reason. Not exactly like we can go on much of an adventure with it, because it's slow as anything. With a top speed of 90 miles an hour and taking a full 9 seconds to hit 0 to 60, you can still almost beat that speed by just going on foot. Again, I've looked at vehicle toughness for everything in this video, and for this car it remains largely unchanged. The tires pop with a single bullet, the engine explodes after firing 2.1 magazines from Dying Night into it, or 2 projectiles from the arm cannon, making it not equipped for getting anywhere quickly or surviving the trip. Useful still for the impoverished commuting NC citizen, but not so much for us. First-person visibility is pretty good though, but a bit of a squeeze if Johnny decides to spawn in with us now. Basically, it's only worth buying for vehicle-owning completionists. I mean, you start the game with a better car than this. The Mahir Supron FS3, a minivan which even Reyes himself describes on the website as like a group of hobos glued together a bathtub and a trash can and slapped on some dinner plates for wheels. On balance, I would definitely agree with that description. Though if you've a tendency to drive in first person, the dashboard I don't utterly hate. And for 16,000 eddies, you'll be able to hit a whole 98 miles an hour with a 0 to 60 of 10 seconds, which again, on balance, isn't brilliant. In fact, it's terrible. Combat readiness testing too showed up less than favorable results, and the thing is said to rate F in crash testing. That said, driving it into actual combat, it did last a good several seconds, and bullying the one car lower than it, the Thorton Galena, did actually see some success. But overall, there's just 2 reasons to own it. One, you're a poor NC citizen with a tendency to go away on short camping trips, or B, you're a merc, running a job for which you need a cheap burner vehicle, albeit one that's big enough to carry your equipment. At 19,000 eddies, the Villefort Columbus is worth purchasing for one reason and one reason alone: as a portable, extra ledge to stand on top of and reach plenty of additional higher places. Good in early game as one of the first cars we can buy, and good in later game as well, when we can combine it with a bunch of additional jump improving cyberware. Other than that, it has a top speed of 100, 0 to 60 of 11 seconds, one of the worst accelerations in the game, and first person visibility is just okay, though it gets very cut off in the lower half of the screen. Canonically, this one was owned by a former drug smuggler, and lore-wise, that's really what these things are for: cargo hauling, or maybe converting into a larger family going away van, a la a bigger Mahir Supron. But given neither of those things are features in this game, or at least for this vehicle, we'll hold on to it simply for those ledge-reaching capabilities. Hell, even as a big vehicle, it really does nothing special in combat, and there are way better options higher up the list for that. The Columbus itself is, and always has been, quite by design, one of the worst cars or vehicles in the game. What happens when you take the tiny compactness of the Makigai MaiMai and build instead something a bit more heavy? Meet the Makigai Tanishi T400, a ride that, quote, looks like it was designed by a child, but rides like it was tuned by ex-military doomsday preppers. A quote that I would imagine in real life was ripped straight from a review of the Cybertruck. Though this thing isn't quite a Cybertruck. Taking a whole 12 seconds to hit 60 mph and only managing a top speed of 95, it is through and through one of the slowest cars in the game. Though, to be fair, speed isn't its purpose, and Mr. Hands gifted this exact vehicle to us upon entering Dogtown for a very good and very specific reason. Its size makes it easy to navigate the thin, often barricaded streets, whilst its toughness makes it preferable in some cases to a bike, say, especially in the eternal combat zone that is Dogtown. Granted, I never actually use it to get around Dogtown, that tends to be an on-foot air dash job anyway. Still, if you do want to drive, then I guess it's an okay choice for navigating tight corners, and either way it is free, so less of a choice over acquiring it and more about just whether it's worth using. Slow car, but somewhat sturdy. To anyone wanting to relive some 80s family memories, not that I'm old enough for any of those, but the Thorton Colby C125 I think can do that. As the classic American family station wagon design a la National Lampoon, it's basically the go-to vehicle of the poorer NC family, larger than say 2 or 3. Heavier, but with a lot more horsepower than the alternative Thornton Galena, it'll reach 60 in about 8 seconds, topping out at 100 mph. Not really worth the 18,000 eddies when our Archer Hella starter just beats that, and my combat tests also had it perform at pretty much minimum toughness, and first-person visibility, as a lower-priced car, is just straight up bad. So why then have I bumped it up a couple spots? Well, because, as it turns out, the Thornton Colby is pretty good at ferrying other vehicles. Twice was I able to scoop up a Wraith Archer Quartz Spectre and ferry it a good ways down the road, something that even Johnny was shocked to see.
What the fuck?
So, if you like just messing about, abusing some game mechanics with the cars, then this one's definitely worth a cheap buy. Otherwise, probably just buy it anyway for the Gone in 60 Seconds reference. This exact model was apparently previously owned by Nicolas Cage, who kept it as his all reliable despite the many supercars he'd clapped over the course of his career. If any of you guys are here that hate Pan Am and maybe the Aldecaldo quests in general, I know you exist, I've seen you in the comments, then you'll actually probably love this vehicle and want to buff it up a great many spots. As for the rest of you, this is a minuscule consolation prize for failing one of the best quest lines in the game, missing out on one of the best romances and the best ending all in one fell swoop, with arguably the worst decision we can make in the entire game. During the With a Little Help from My Friends quest, if we go behind Pan Am's back and tell Saul about the plan to steal the Basilisk, he'll shut the whole operation down. Pan Am will understandably be pissed and cut all ties with us, and the Aldecaldos will move camp and disappear from the game. Before they do though, Saul, as a little way of saying thanks for going along with what he believed to be best, will leave behind, admittedly, one hell of a nice car. The weaponized Shion Bonewrecker goes from 0 to 60 in just 4 seconds, 0 to 120 in about 16, and tops out at speeds of about 150. Speed and off-road handling are really what it's built for though, and it doesn't excel massively in combat, nor does it have a particularly great interior visibility. It's incredibly similar stats-wise in fact to the Shion Samu, found far higher up this list, whilst being significantly slower still than the Shion Coyote, and whilst those cars will set us back 87 and 77k respectively, the Bonewrecker exacts a toll far higher, I would say. And from a certain point of view, I'd say it's the only car in this game that's just too costly to obtain, hence its probably unfairly low placements. Unless you actually do hate Pan Am, then it's a whole different story. The Chevillon Thrax Jefferson was the car owned by Dexter DeShawn, and that should really tell you everything you need to know about this thing, putting across the illusion of top dog who has it all together, cruising around in a cool, almost limousine-esque ride, whilst in actuality just about doing what it's supposed to do. Sure, it can stand up to a few more bullets, but going by its appearance, it should be tougher than this still. And it may call itself the heaviest car ever allowed to roam the streets, despite being beaten quite significantly by several other cars, but that doesn't make it any faster. It looks slow, and it is. Perhaps the reason then that it's responsible for a quarter of all pedestrian collisions is because people that buy it, such as Dex, are too busy upholding their facade of Night City gangster that they forget to focus on the road ahead. Speaking of, its first-person visibility is fine, but nothing amazing. And at 34K, I can't really think of a reason to sink that much into it. You're definitely better off saving your eddies for something faster and possibly even customizable now. And this is really just there for completionists. The design is somewhat cool, okay, sure, but that's definitely a style over substance thing. When the Barghest militia set up shop in Dogtown, they needed a cheap, mass-produced vehicle to convert into their bottom-line troop carriers. Understandable then that they chose the bog-standard Thorton Colby, decked it out with armor, chucked a turret on the top, and renamed it simply the Colby Barghest. In fairness, what we are left with is a pretty cool and very tough-looking vehicle. It's just a shame that in practice, said toughness is altogether non-existent. These unpoppable-looking tires actually still pop in just one hit, and whilst the armor does do a fair bit to shield the engine, it's not actually all that much. To be honest, this is probably something to be grateful for. You'll no doubt be fighting many more of these than you'll be driving, particularly if you get into a lot of fights around Dogtown, and destroying them as they pull up is a far more efficient way to deal with the Barghest militia. Plus, the thing is slow, both in top speed and acceleration, and clutters up its dashboard more so than the Thornton Colby with even more, well, clutter, making it tough to drive in first person too. Though, since 2.0, they have at least fixed the part where you couldn't shoot from it at a 360-degree angle, making it a still viable combat vehicle like it was designed to be, just not a very good one. I guess you could say that the Archer Hella is to V what Roach is to Geralt, or at least that's what's implied by the Roach decal found on the side. Canonically, I think V's definitive car eventually becomes the Turbo R VTEC, but this canonically is V's starter car, or V's starter city car if you're a nomad. Nothing special in terms of stats, especially when it comes to speed, but nosing ahead still compared to many of the other cheaper early vehicles. Contextually, as the best people's car ever made though, brought out in 2023 with most lasting just fine for the full 54 years, some of that build-to-lastness does seep through into combat. Tires puncture in 2 shots, and the engine can take a bit more of a beating than most. So it's somewhat forgiving if you're messing around with vehicle combat in early game. In fact, this car was apparently built to last so well that many people purchased them and just never needed a replacement car, taking many customers who were simply after a reliable A to B vehicle off the market for good. Meaning Archer would eventually need to release the sportier Quartz model to bring in a new line of customers. And sure, whilst the Quartz is objectively better, and we'll come to several variants of that, this, as far as starter cars go, has a nice level of homely charm. What if you took the worst car in the game, the Thornton Galena, made it still as similar as possible, whilst actually making it sort of, kind of, a little bit good too? Well, one of the new 2.2 editions, the Thornton Galena GA32T, does just that. For the heftier, but not horrible price of 26,000 eddies, you'll get a top speed up to 105 and a 0 to 60 of just 6 seconds. Significantly better acceleration than its predecessor, and rightfully granted it the title of sports car, or street-level sports car. The kind that wannabe boy racers get as soon as they can drive, who couldn't care less about the 1-star safety rating. Indeed, this has all the soul, toughness, or lack thereof, and caveats of the standard Galena, just with a little more oomph, but enough to give it some charm, alongside its racing stripe. And it's also got really good visibility, if you do enjoy driving in first person. Worth buying, at any rate, given it's a new ownable addition to the game, but also a nice budget entry-level sports car. Now, do you know how long it took me to retest and put together this comprehensive list of every vehicle in this game? No, me neither, but it was a while for sure. And one thing that really stole away my time and inevitably pushed the release of this video back was the daily need to plan and cook meals. Man's annoyingly got to eat. But I've been using HelloFresh a hell of a lot this year, as that at least takes out the planning side of things, and it has no doubt saved me a ton more up time when making videos, though it's actually their sister company Factor where the most time is saved overall. Much like HelloFresh, Factor deliver fresh and healthy meals straight to your door, with a huge weekly menu to choose from to enjoy a range of chef-prepared cuisines. But more importantly, Factor meals come ready to eat, so you can simply heat them up in 2 minutes, eat, enjoy, and get straight back to whatever important task you were grinding to complete. Like, driving around in video game cars for other people's entertainment. Right now, you can get 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box using my link. So click that down in the description, or just scan the QR code on screen with your phone, or use my code SamBramJan50. Every new subscription will be directly supporting this channel, so go check them out if you want simple but still brilliant meals. But with that, it's back to the world of petrol, or I suppose synthetically grown petrol alternatives. In 2041, 18 years after the Archer company released the Hella, a car so reliable and durable that they took many customers off the market for good, they finally branched out with a new model to get them back into the vehicle race, now needing to appeal to a new audience of car enthusiasts. And whilst the EC-L R275 model was the first Quartz off the production line, it's only been newly available to own since 2.2. For just 21,000 eddies, 10k cheaper than the Quartz that's always been in the game, you will find this one has a significantly lower horsepower and reduced top speed of just 106, though can accelerate to 60 in 7 seconds. Not hugely impressive, especially for a sports car, though it does handle the narrow streets of Night City okay, though that's maybe just because it's kinda slow. Worth buying, for sure, even just for the novelty of having another new car in our virtual garage, and it's undoubtedly the cheapest sports car in the game that we have to pay for. It's also got a lovely interior, arguably nicer than the otherwise much better standard Archer Quartz, and I really enjoyed driving it in first person. Just don't expect the reduced price to be simply a bargain. There are still many caveats to driving this one. The Villefort Cortes Valor delivers in a way that the Thrax Jefferson should have. Still looking like a cool, tough, limousine-esque car, but maintaining the level of actual toughness that it ought to. There's a reason that the NCPD drive around in souped-up versions of these things, same as they do with the Archer Hella models. They're reliable and relatively cheap. With a top speed of 118 and 0 to 60 of 7 seconds, it actually beats the Jefferson there, and feels less weighty when it comes to handling too. This particular model that we can own was bought by a rich corpo family for their son's birthday. Again, this car is the reliable, safe model they were happy for their child to drive around in, though he never did so. Just stayed on the couch, gorging himself on BDs until eventually being disowned, thus granting us a brand new and decent, albeit very pink car for just 28k. A nice 2-in-1 now. The Thorton Colby Butte is what happens when you take the classic American family car and make it significantly cooler. Cooler looking, anyway, what with its pickup truck suspension, offering far more utility for a variety of merc work around NC. Reyes has always sold this thing as a good way to transport rolled up carpets, and in 2.2 I found this actually sort of worked, at least until the body, the carpet straight up despawned. As far as ramming enemies in close quarters goes though, it is okay for that, but with a 0 to 60 of 11 seconds now, 3 more than the standard Colby, you'd better hope you hit to kill the first time around. Warming up for a second run at them will take uncomfortably long. So why then does it beat the standard Colby, despite having the same top speed and costing another 7 grand and having a slower acceleration? Well, just because it looks cooler. Plus, I kind of weirdly love the blue interior of the paid-for green model, despite its poor actual first-person visibility. But more importantly with the Butte is the ability to obtain another version of it absolutely free by trekking out to the desert film set in the eastern Badlands. This model, now with its own name, the Thornton Colby Grand Butte, is a design I don't love quite as much as the green, but it is a free vehicle, well worth picking up, maybe after completing the Ghost Town quest and heading up this way with Pan Am. The Thorton Colby Butte may be a decent entry to standard pickup trucks, but for 8,000 eddies more, you're far better off selecting the Thorton Mackinaw. Labelled the heavyweight when it comes to pickups, yet going from 0 to 60 in just 7 seconds, almost half the time of the Butte. Its far greater horsepower also affords a better top speed of 110, and combat-wise as well, whilst there's sturdier things out there, this one is definitely a higher scorer. And after spending some time with our own, it's a lot more understandable just why Pan Am was so desperate to get hers back. I mean, sure, it's no Caliburn or Quadra 66, but it's definitely a car with a soul. More so, arguably even, than its tuned-up counterparts, Beast and the Sahara with their washed-out greys. And whilst this one may be more oriented generally for city living, it can handle the Badlands reasonably well too, with off-road drifting and landing just fine should you happen to, say, drive off a cliff. Just maybe don't get out if you're parked precariously, since that'd risk falling into oblivion like I did and magically appearing back at your last fast travel. Don't know what's up with that. The Alvarado Herman is the definitive mob boss car of 2077, or at least it's the definitive retired mob boss car if you slap on about another 10 years of time and our top of his game mob boss has settled down to become a family man. Still wanting to drive around in this car to look powerful, but replacing the small boot space for stashing away gonks that cross him with something a little more PG. That being space for the many children our guy can no doubt afford to have in his life at this point, fortunate enough to cruise around in safety and comfort. But should the occasional police chase still happen to ensue, there's still the option of Crystal Coat now to completely change appearance and throw the cops off the trail. Of course, this car is slightly heavier and thus slightly slower than its alternate version, and for an extra 1k, in the case of V who doesn't have a family to ferry around, it naturally sits one place lower than the alternative. The actual definitive mob boss car of 2077, I would say, the Delegate succeeds where most models like the Thrax Jefferson fail. And maybe, if Dexter DeShawn had sunk a few extra eddies from the off and bought a proper show of power, he wouldn't have wound up such a colossal failure. With a grand total of 6 wheels, there isn't a much more limousine-esque car than this. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that this thing was previously owned by a Valentino, though one who had to sell it after making the wrong enemies and needing to leave his old life behind. Or maybe he was just chased off for not sporting the classic Valentino emblems on his ride. Or Reyes resprayed it, one or the other. In fact, it's another of the cheaper vehicles we can own now that come equipped with Crystal Coat tech. And given it's a reasonably common vehicle out on the roads overall, I expect to find plenty of unique paintworks out there just ripe for the copying. With a 0 to 60 of 9 seconds and top speed of 118, it's no speed demon, and nor is it trying to be that. In fact, you're probably better off calling it a style demon, just as a mob boss deserves. In fact, we actually have some breathing room from Johnny here, but there's also just a slither of window to see out of, so you might want to stick to third person with this one. But even better still than the Delegate for several reasons is the Villefort Alvarado Vato. If the owner of the Delegate was indeed driven off and not sporting all the Valentino emblems, then El Cesar definitely wasn't. Instead, fully proving himself as a devout Valentino loyalist. Well, except for the fact that he's forced to bet this thing in a boxing match, which we of course end up winning for the beat on the Brad quests. Now, generally I do kind of end up paying for this one, I guess, letting him keep the eddies to raise his almost born child, but you can of course be completely cold, take the car and leave him with nothing. Let me know what you did with this one down in the comments. Of course, there's even more reason to keep this car nowadays, as the Crystal Coat feature allows you to completely remove the golden Valentino decor, if, you say hated it, basically making it instead just a convertible Alvarado Delegate. With the exact same horsepower, albeit slightly heavier due to the lack of overhead chassis support, this thing runs ever so slightly slower, but with the same acceleration time, more or less. It definitely wins when it comes to first-person visibility though, and given Night City isn't exactly a cold place, I'm sure V, and Johnny for that matter, would much prefer to feel the breeze driving around in this. At just 26,000 eddies, the new Villefort Deleon V410S Coupe is an absolute steal. 10k cheaper than the Deleon Vindicator, but with all the same stats, save for a slightly worse acceleration. I mean, this one is just a standard vehicle after all, but what you do get at that price is some of the cheapest access now to Crystal Coat twin-tone technology. Indeed, there is no point assessing the standard grey that this vehicle comes in, and I have found at least one unique twin-tone out on the road, this white, specifically for Deleon models. This car was apparently a 4-year restoration project for a corpo gearhead, though he sadly never returned from a shuttle to the moon recently, leaving this to be sold off at a very reasonable price. And sure, 117 mile an hour and a 9-second 0 to 60 is nothing to get excited about, but if you're low on eddies, maybe early in the game, and want a car to express yourself with ASAP, then this is a cheap choice. And for first-person drivers too, it does, to be fair, have a pretty clean interior view. Now, Makigai don't make that many vehicles, but the ones that they do stay true to one staple: small and compact. Whilst the MaiMai is wonderfully hilarious and higher on this list for that simple reason, the Tanishi Kuma takes everything about the free T400 and improves upon it massively. Sitting somewhere between dune buggy and jeep, this thing was built to traverse the Badlands with brilliant capability. It's admittedly lacking in speed, and a 10-second 0 to 60 is nothing special at all, but there's absolutely no doubt that this is a fun exploration vehicle. It's also one of the best options out there for those who prefer a first-person view, as the low dashboard means most of our screen will quite simply be the open road, and it's fairly easy to handle too. Good to have if you're doing your Badlands exploration early on in the game, but otherwise it does simply get overtaken by faster, tougher, more expensive Nomad vehicles, sadly. Still, I'd say it's worth having, if not just for the Jeep aesthetic. If you're after a vehicle for both safety and security, then the Emperor 620 Ragnar is a good starting bet. So named after one of my favourite characters from television, though that is however going to be this vehicle's biggest merits. It's got a fair bit of speed once it gets going, and the acceleration isn't terrible, but nothing to get it anywhere near the top of the leaderboards. Nor was it really designed for these purposes. Instead, this very often fills the role of heavier duty military and police vehicle on account of its capacity and durability, though it's not actually as durable on paper as you'd expect, especially when it comes to tires. Johnny may be a vehicle companion now of sorts, but even still, this thing's troop carrying capacity doesn't really mean anything for us. Hence, unless you're just trying to vary your roster of vehicles with something heavier looking, the 38k for this thing is better spent on one of the sport or dirt cars for zipping around Night City quicker. The Thorton Merrimac Warlock entered into an already pretty crowded game of Thorton trucks. The Butte was a cheap station wagon with massively raised suspension, and the Mackinaw was, well, the pickup truck. But this Australian import still boasts plentiful merits of its own. Its 7-second 0 to 60 may match the Mackinaw, but with a top speed of 120, it wins there by a fair margin. The interior view is also okay, not great, not terrible, and the durability admittedly is somewhat lacking. However, this is yet another car sported by the NCPD, and more than that, it's specifically sported by MaxTac, the most elite law enforcement squad ever, and with good reason. This is a fantastic all-rounder vehicle, which wins out on a stat far harder to quantify: handling. With a combination of brilliant cornering and ramming capabilities, this thing can plow through busy, windy roads in pursuit of any cyberpsychos causing chaos in built-up regions, whilst also sporting the interior space to cart away said cyberpsychos to also be recruited into MaxTac, I guess. Now, apparently this model in particular that we can own should have originally been manufactured with a right-hand driver's seat, and it's kind of a mystery why it isn't. I again think that that's a huge shame and a unique merit of this car to be missed out on, so maybe in a future patch they'll release another version which does have said right-hand drive, and therefore give me an excuse to make this video all over again. So I've done a few editions of this all cars ranked video over the years, and something that's always sat right around the very bottom is the horrifically slow minivan, the Mahir Supron FS3, a vehicle slated even by its own sellers. However, as it turns out, if we slap the letter T for turbo into the title, this little thing becomes surprisingly good. About halving its 0 to 60 time down to 5 seconds and buffing the top speed to 120 if you're lucky, that makes it one of the nippiest cheaper vehicles money can buy. No bonuses on the durability side of things, and visibility is more or less the same, though given this thing is designed for a group of 4 chooms to go on a lad's camping trip in, Johnny will actually spawn in the back seats of this thing, a detail which almost sent me off the road a couple times when I realized, and which looks cool in both third and first person, along with the entire decor of the vehicle, to be fair. We may not be able to own the Supron's mystery machine skin, but this thing has one hell of a cool lighting design which feels almost sponsored by a drinks company. Mind you, Reyes does make sure to point out in the description that he has not been sponsored when selling us this vehicle. Good on you, Reyes. Again, go check out Factor in the description or pinned comment. Delamain is of course a very unique car, one of many operated by the AI taxi service, and our personal reward for completing his chain of mini-quests. Stats-wise, it's no different at all to the Cortes Valor, hell, possibly even slightly slower to accelerate by my reckoning, though they're probably identical given their matching weight and horsepower. Where Delamain wins out by a fair bit then is on account of the fact that he'll actually talk to you, his personality being dependent on the outcome to the Don't Lose Your Mind quest. Quick spoiler warning for the end of that, so jump to the next timestamp if that's an issue. At the end of the quest, you'll have to choose from 3 options, incredibly reminiscent of Mass Effect 3. Destroy Delamain and let his rogue variants go, reset him and bring them under control, or attempt to merge the personalities into what you might call a synthesis. I've done a full breakdown for this in my toughest decisions video, but in brief, by full-on resetting Delamain, we'll get the original voice still, with which we can discuss the intricacies of human nature, what is love, and much, much more. That's not to say it's the best ending overall, but it is purely in terms of getting the most extra content after the quest. Hence, the Delamain cab is bumped a few spots above the standard Valor. Sadly though, unlike the Delamain cab from the heist, there's no automated systems whatsoever, no ability to program a route and have Del auto-drive there, and no combat mode, even though we could say plenty of other vehicles do have that. Hell, Del doesn't even stare at us through where the rear view mirror would be anymore. So still a cool car and a nice reward, but could have still been 10 times more unique and cool. The only thing making it more taxi-like in 2.2 now in fact, is that Johnny spawns in the back, not the front, which I guess makes the taxi driver us. Newly added in 2.2, the Thorton Colby CST40 may look basically the same as the C125, but under the hood, it's a completely different story. Described when scanned as stitched together helter-skelter by some scared-out engineer, and reanimated with a drive system to give this relatively common car an exciting new lease on life. With all-wheel drive and an engine borrowed from its twin model, the CX410 Butte, this ride is the first choice for bored office workers everywhere who are fighting through a midlife crisis. Indeed, this improved take on the regular Colby can now reach speeds of up to 130 with a reduced 0 to 60 time of just 5 seconds. Its durability too is significantly improved, and Reyes' description as a perfect low-profile merc car is entirely fair, something nobody would ever suspect, which can probably escape the cops simply by confusing them with its speed. In first-person mode, you may find it somewhat difficult to see and drive, but in third, it makes for a far improved family car experience to its ancient predecessor. Not necessarily worth it at almost double the price, 33,000 eddies, but given its status as ownable, is brand new in 2.2, it's still a fun new thing to have. Whilst the Archer Quartz R275 was a fun addition to 2.2, the main thing it did for me was show off just how good the Archer Quartz R660 actually is, especially for a car available at just 31,000 eddies. This one may sport the same durability stats as its chronological predecessor and sport a darker, less attractive interior in my opinion, but other than that, this car shines a million times brighter. With an increased top speed to 130 on flat terrain and hugely reduced reduced 0 to 60 time of just 4 seconds, this is one of the best bargain sports cars you can get in Cyberpunk. And fine, it's gonna get blown out the water by later entries, many of which are free and thus reducing the reason to buy this car, yet I can't help but love this little thing, especially after learning what a labor of love it was by the previous owner, a man who paid it more attention than his ex-wife, subsequently resulting in their divorce. The irony here being that in order to afford his divorce fees, he had to sell the thing he loved the very most, and now the poor guy is wifeless and carless. But seeing as the Quartz is also the classic 17-year-old boy racer car, it is responsible for 17% of traffic collisions, despite making up just 2% of road users. So maybe we just saved the guy's life by taking it off his hands. The reward, if you will, for selecting the Nomad life path, the Thorton Galena Rattler will potentially be your first example of just how good the Galena can be. First demonstration that Nomads can take even the worst car out there and turn it into something special. And it's certainly not the last example of this either. With a nice top speed of 130, but significantly more impressive 0 to 60 of about 3 or 4 seconds, this is a special car. Though again, only for like a third of players. Not quite reason enough to play a Nomad by itself, but the quest tied to reobtaining it is kinda sweet. See, V will scrap this after the prologue and only rediscover it after returning to the Badlands for the main questline, receiving a text that it's back up and running again thanks to somebody attempting to fix it up for themselves. And this turns out to be YouTuber Alana Pierce, aka in the game Lana Prince, and her character seemingly has the ability to suss out how rich we are and will charge a varying amount for the car based on how high our level is. So make sure if doing this quest later on that you're significantly stocked up on eddies. You could also let her keep the car, but that means trading off one of the only vehicle interiors with a bobblehead, which as far as I'm aware makes it a canon car of V's, or Nomad V's at any rate. If you're a big fan of the Hozuki Hozuki found higher up this list, then Update 2.2 would like to interest you in a down-to-street level civilian version. This standard, unmodified Hozuki MH2 was previously part of a failed bomb plot, where some activists attempted to drive a tied-up corpo into a Militech HQ, but their botched homemade bomb didn't explode, and Reyes was given the seized vehicle to pawn off secondhand. Basically, it sports the same stats as the Hozuki did back in 2.1, but upon rechecking that car's stats for comparison, the Hozuki has since been buffed, thus fittingly giving the standard MH2 its old spot. And for just 29,000 eddies, that is one hell of a steal. 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, 120 in 20, and a top speed of 130 make this thing a sports car to compete with the Quartz. But with its practically identical stats, slightly lower price, and perfectly good interior visibility, this car gets to sit above the Quartz, though you may still want to wait and save another 8k eddies for its specialist equivalents, unless you're a particular fan of this lizardy texture. You're possibly wondering, what the hell is a tiny, slow little thing like the Makigai MaiMai doing this high up the list? Well above plenty of vehicles that are, in every quantifiable term, just better. Well, the MaiMai has something that none of them do, and that's hilarity factor. Since V is, without a doubt, the best, most capable, most invincible merc in the whole of NC, rocking up to gigs in the least intimidating car possible is just funny. I mean, even up next to a Tanishi T400, this thing looks tiny. Hell, I think it's so small that not even Silverhand spawned in whilst I was driving it, which has happened for pretty much every other car so far in 2.2. I'd compare it to a Golf buggy, but those are probably bigger as well. In some ways, it is excellent at navigating narrow streets, able to weave through gaps most other cars couldn't, but that's somewhat offset by the general handling, which isn't as responsive as other vehicles. Plus, with the existence of bikes, size isn't as much of an advantage here as it is just funny looking. So many spaces above where it probably belongs on meme factor alone. The Deleon family may have its new addition in 2.2, but that's still not beaten by the original Phantom Liberty model, the Thorton Deleon Vindicator. In fact, checking again and comparing to my previous notes, I could swear the Deleon Vindicator has seen something of a stat boost lately. Now with a reduced 0 to 60 of 5 seconds, down from 7, and a hugely higher top speed than I remember of 140. At just 36,000 eddies, that's also quite the steal. Plus, with the new addition of Crystal Coat Twin Tone, neither this nor the standard Coupe are really competing when it comes to style. So why not just save the extra 10k and get some vastly better stats? This, apparently, is the type of vehicle a cop will pull you over in just to get a picture with. I mean, I assume that'd be more the case with Caliburns and Arandites, but maybe that's to say this is the only cool car cheap enough that a cop would dare to pull you over. Who knows? Definitely bumped up a few spots by any accounts from its previous ranking though. With about 9 variants of the Quadra Type-66 car in the game now, we're starting the placements for these fairly low. Though, with our first entry, it's fair to say we've entered a new league of vehicles in the ranking. For 40,000 eddies, you can get, as of 2.2, the worst Quadra 66 of the bunch. The standard 640 TS model sports the lowest horsepower of 555, which in fairness is still pretty impressive, hitting top speeds of 150, not to 60ing in 4 seconds, and reaching 120 in about 17. Nice stats, but I'd argue there's more unassuming cars back further down the list, which surprised and impressed me more. For a Type 66, this is the bare minimum one would expect for admittedly the lowest price. The standard cream and blue texture is a nice contrast to many of the darker models, but this doesn't massively matter thanks to twin tone, and there are an array of unique twin tones for the 640 around Night City for you to scan, making this car, along with most of the other Type 66s, more uniquely your own. The interior has a nice and unchanging pink leather texture, but given the lack of first-person visibility for this one, you probably won't be seeing that too much. And as far as unique selling points go, all Reyes can say is it's a cool car that'll get you a lot of attention. So basically the same as all the others, though not quite as good. Another of the more powerful additions to 2.2 is the Mizutani Shion MZ1, a predecessor to the MZ2 unsurprisingly, and one which packs a significantly lower horsepower, though for a full 14,000 eddies less, will reach 60 miles an hour in about the same 4 seconds, though taking about 5 seconds longer to hit the 120 mark and topping out a while later at just 153, a fair bit less than its successor. Its cheaper price also won't make you stand out in Night City streets quite as much, as it is apparently the most frequently seen sports car in Night City. This particular one was owned by a street racing legend who recently had to skip town for some reason. Its standard paintwork definitely looks the part of street racer to be feared, but even more exciting, I'd say, is the somewhat more unique twin tones we can give it, with little spray paint bits found elsewhere on other vehicles. Though bear in mind, we can apply said same paintworks to the MZ2. Otherwise, I'd give this car a point for looking nicer than its successor model. However, now there's not quite as much reason to own it thanks to twin tone and these tires actually popping, unlike the MZ2. So the MZ1, same as the 640 Type 66, is really only worth it if you're a completionist wanting a bigger sports car collection. Basically another Quadra 66 640 TS. In fact, that was still this car's name until 2.2. The Type 66 Bullet is our award for completing all 5 of the city center gigs for Dino Dinovic, some of which have story threads that run incredibly deep across the game. Check out this video for more details there. The car itself, though, is one of the most basic Type 66s out there, though just beats the now standard entry on account of having 7 less curb weight and technically coming under the classification of free gift. Plus, of course, it's got a much cooler name now, making it a more on the nose nod to the actual movie Bullet, starring Steve McQueen. The green color, of course, having always made this one a particular nod to that film. Though, now with twin tone, of course, the car can look however you want, with the name mostly now maintaining the movie reference. Mixing it up with a more combat-oriented vehicle now, Mahir Supron Trailbruiser is the second in the lineup of militaried-up Dogtown prowling vehicles, this time taking another cheap, generally awful vehicle and turning it into something truly to go to war in. At 94,000 eddies, the Trailbruiser is even better than the standard models of this that Barghest are roaming around in, thanks to modifications made by somebody gonk enough to cross Colonel Hanson. I mean, who would do such a thing? Not only is this one packed packed with missiles and machine guns, but its off-road suspension also makes it a vehicle of choice when engaged in combat anywhere on the map. The Trailbruiser may not boast massively special endurance stats on paper in my tests, but up against NCPD and many vehicles exploding right next to it, it lasted a hell of a lot longer than most cars would. On speed and acceleration alone, it would belong right down with the bottom dwellers, but sometimes you just want to drive into the midst of combat and back out again, which is when you take this. At least once you've completed enough auto-fixer missions to unlock the thing. But since it's otherwise pretty bad at just getting from A to B, it's still right the ways down here in this very competitive list. The first entry from the bikes next, and whilst there's 11 different models of these we can own in the game, there's only really 3 distinct builds of bike, those being the Brennan Apollo, Arch Nazare, and Yaiba Kusanagi. And in order not to simply list all of them at the same time, one after another, they can be ranked not just according to stats, but also acquisition, sentimentality, and given the lack of bike crystal coats, design as well. Hence, down here, at just 30k eddies, is the standard Brennan Apollo, sporting the same durability stats as all the bikes with instantly puncturing tires, 2.2 dying night mags to the engine before exploding, and surviving just 1 projectile. The Apollo also hits top speeds of just 107 and gets to 60 in 6 seconds. That's not incredible, even compared to many of the lower tier cars, but bikes in general in this game are all round just much more versatile and better, especially after the additional mechanics they got in 2.1. Not only are they just smaller and more maneuverable than cars, but we can also do flips and wheelies, wield and sometimes throw melee weapons from atop them, and the most fun thing I like to do is gun-propelled jumps. These are best performed with the Leica or Comrade's hammer hand cannons, but can be pulled off to a lesser effect with revolver models like the Tegan. Simply pointing at the ground and firing in third person can launch V both high and far to traverse a whole world of additional obstacles and reach otherwise unobtainable places on a vehicle. It's also a far more efficient means of changing lanes. So, for 30k eddies, this is one of the cheaper models to enjoy all of that, but kind of irrelevant given we get better models for free very early in the game. This one's really just worth it if you particularly like the pink and gold. Another Quadra Type-66 model now, the General Lee packs a fair bit more horsepower than its predecessors, 616 instead of 555, which in practical terms means hitting 120 5 seconds faster, in 12, not 17. Much like the Bullet, this car is also inspired by real-life pop culture, in this case being the Dodge Charger from Dukes of Hazzard, and the name General Lee sounding like General Lee, in a thick, I guess, country accent. And this orange texture with the flag on the roof remains of course unique to this car, but if you don't really care about that, there is now an identical model, the 680TS added in 2.2, which performs the exact same. General Lee costs 52,000 eddies to buy, which is now 2k more than the alternative. Both can also then look identical if we change their skins with Crystal Coat Twin Tone. So really, you'd have to be a car completionist to buy both, and at 2k eddies more, despite the reference, this therefore places just 1 slot lower, much to the ire of 6th Street's Ultra Patriots, one of whom of course was the previous owner of this specific vehicle, meeting his own sorry end after accidentally zeroing some corpo. So, for the sake of saving 2,000 eddies, you can just grab up the new unmodified Type-66 680TS. Obviously, a markup in models than the 640, hence the buff in horsepower. And I can only assume that 2 more of these 66s were added on account of then having ownable, bare-bones, unnamed, uncharacterized quadras to express ourselves with, as was the theme of the 2.2 update. It's a nice touch, and I'm even a fan of the unedited standard paintwork for this one, though there's not really much difference than that from the General Lee model. Even the interiors are very similar, with neither particularly easy to see out of, though it's still nice to see my line of Quadra 66s grow even bigger in 2.2. A slight departure from Type 66s now, the Quadra Turbo R is in many ways better and sometimes worse than the models reviewed in the list thus far. It feels more like a sports car than, say, a muscle car, and was canonically the best-selling of the last decade, with 300,000 units produced in 2075 alone. As a popular vehicle, when Reyes has one listed for sale, he warns it likely won't stay on the market for long. Worrying, perhaps, or at least it would be, if cars ever disappeared from auto fixer without our buying them. For a heftier price of 69,000 eddies this time, we'll once again net a 4-second 0 to 60. In fact, most vehicles in this sort of tier accelerate to that in about 4 seconds, so from now on it's more worth noting than 0 to 120, which for this is about 14 seconds. Slower than the aforementioned Type 66s, but with a higher top speed of 160, there are winning factors too. If you enjoy driving in first person, then this model is the clear winner of the two, with significantly more visibility and therefore easier maneuverability. Plus, it's definitely the more unique of the two, sharing its unique twin-tone designs only with the Turbo R VTEC instead of several other Type 66s. Though, that there is a reason you may as well leave this model, since the VTEC is its superior equivalent and obtainable, in a sense, completely for free. Now, I've been a big fan of the Haseki since its debut in Phantom Liberty, but possibly thanks to the introduction of the basic MH2, the Haseki has received a number of buffs of its own now. With a slightly higher top speed of 138, though significantly better 0 to 60 of 3 seconds and 0 to 120 of 12, meaning over short distances, the thing can compete with some significantly more popular, albeit significantly more expensive, sport and supercars, making this one in particular an utter steal. And whilst Mizutani's whole idea behind the Hozuki MH1 and 2 models was to bring a more user-friendly, fun for the whole family kind of vibe, the Haseki is another beast entirely, transformed by a corpo named Adrian Mayer to take on the dusty Badlands racing circuit and becoming more of a dirt racer itself. Though perhaps Adrienne should have invested a little more into the air filters, as she died of pneumoconiosis shortly after, a lung disease caused no doubt by breathing in irradiated sand dust. Her plaque, in fact, can be found at the Columbarium, with the quote inscribed, "This is how you live." And nice to know that she enjoyed life outside the corpo work grind at least, unlike most of them. And now we can honour her legacy by enjoying the car too. Only place that it loses to the MH2, I'd say, is the slightly vision-obscuring banner for first-person driving. But otherwise, it's a far superior model both for on- and off-road travel. Our second bike for this list is yet another variant of the Brennan Apollo, unsurprisingly, given that it's the slowest bike type of the game, serving more favourably as an off-road dirt bike than street racer generally. Though in the case of the 650S model, it has been rejigged to specialise entirely as a low-powered street racer, for like half the price of faster models to be fair. The increased price tag from the standard Apollo though, of 36,000 eddies, will gain you slightly more horsepower and a half-second faster 0 to 60, but little else in practical terms. So good luck chasing down other bike users or indeed escaping from NCPD. To be fair, this is actually the same bike model that the NCPD use, more or less, thus actually making it evenly matched in a police chase, at least against the bikers. It's also apparently the most bike-jacked model in NC, given I presume that it's cheaper and therefore going to be more common than say a Nazare or Kusanagi. Again, no huge reasons to specifically own this one unless you're a fan of the design. Scorpion's Apollo is instead, of course, free, as is Jackie's Arch, but to be fair, by that logic, we could say 90% of this list isn't worth owning for practical reasons. So just get it if you think it looks cool, but don't expect anything too amazing. The terrifyingly named Cthulhu is our next entry to the Quadra 66s, with its unique horsepower, this time of 666, leaning even further into the Lovecraftian themes that this car represents. With a top speed of 165 and reaching 120 in 11 seconds, it again far outpaces all other 66s looked at thus far, but does have several more steps involved before we can obtain it, either free or for 67,000 eddies depending on our choices. races. Basically, you'll have to complete the Beast in Me Street Racer questline with Claire right the way through to the end, after which this car, driven by a competitor, will be either given to us or placed up on the Autofixer website for 67k. I won't spoil the exact hows and whys here, but if you are interested, then bookmark my top 5 terrible decisions video to watch another time. Regardless, free or paid for, it is easily one of the toughest Type 66s in the game, and worth having both for getting around and getting into fights, what with its reinforced tires. Again, same trouble with interior visibility as all the other Type 66s, but at least it isn't too bad for some inverted target practice. Now, just pair it up with the Demiurge, and you have one big garage of eldritch horror and unknowable evil. Speaking of the Demiurge though, I was definitely overly generous back in my previous series of vehicle ranking videos with regards to the placement of this one. The Thorton Mackinaw Demiurge is the game's monster truck vehicle, made available in 2.0 as our reward for solving the FF06B5 Easter egg, a mystery that had plagued conspiracy theorists everywhere for the full 2.5 years prior, and which I recounted the solving of at the time in full across my FF06B5 playlist of videos. In very brief explanation terms though, it involves completing an arcade game, solving a secret maze, finding an encoded laptop, playing The Witcher 3, and knowing way too much about hexadecimal conversions before finally AFKing on a random mattress for about 15 minutes and then catching a glimpse into life itself, and the lie that it is. Again, go watch the series for better context. Once that's all done though, the Mackinaw Demiurge will spawn and be ripe for the taking. So named after the god of the physical universe and thematically aligning very much with the Lovecraftian themes behind Cthulhu. This one may only reach top speeds of 104 and take a much longer 9 seconds just to accelerate to 60, and hell, it's not even that great at handling and commands far less road presence than you'd actually expect. But there is still something undeniably awesome about towering above the other NC traffic in this, and knowing that all life around you is probably just a simulation. It's like the complete opposite feeling than the one you get in the MaiMai. Funny to look at still, but having gone completely the other way on the scale. Whilst the Shion MZ1 was a welcome addition to our garage in 2.2, it's still largely undefeated by the originally owned Shion MZ2. Very similar looking, almost identical if we applied the same twin tone to each, but the MZ2 of course is statistically superior in every way. With a top speed of 170, we're getting into serious speeds now, and this car's stats could be perfectly viable as our most commonly used car, especially with the completely unpoppable tires that it's sporting. Something that again feels like a glitch, but I did mention it in a very old video now, and it never got patched, so maybe it's deliberate. Still not a great choice for first person, the Turbo R has that in this league of vehicles thus far, but the MZ2 does sport the same very unique twin tones as the MZ1, and if you're a particular fan of those, then this may just wind up one of your favourite cars. At any rate, I do much prefer the potential reskins of this to its original design. The next two entries, as they've always been, are pretty much almost identical. Those are the Thorton Mackinaw Saguaro, possibly pronounced Saharo, obtained after completing all 9 of Dakota's Badlands gigs, again covered in their own video, and then is the slightly better Mackinaw Beast, from the set of Claire quests that I mentioned earlier. Both of these cars, despite not being amazingly speedy, earn their spots up here on account of 2 things. Their initial acceleration is still very good, 0 to 60 in just 4 seconds, which coupled with their superior Badlands built durability make ideal candidates for vehicle combats anywhere on the map. With very reinforced tires, a strong resistance to gunfire, and seemingly even more buffed ability to stand up to rockets than when I tested them previously, it's understandable why Pan Am was so desperate to get her own variants of this back. The regular Mackinaw may make for a fine early game starter, and to be fair doesn't trail too far behind in terms of raw stats, but given that this one is awarded for free after simply playing the game and doing a set selection of quests, we'll naturally trade out the Mackinaw for the Saharo later, though there is one small reason to pick a Beast overall instead. It's basically identical stats-wise to the Sahara, but Beast still seems to have a tiny bit more explosion resistance, same as it did in 2.0, surviving 1 additional shot from the arm cannon before exploding. Plus, I suppose Beast is a little less work to acquire, given that we only have to complete, I think, 4 street races with Claire, not 9 gigs for Dakota, but do just be careful not to lose out on Beast entirely, which can happen if you completely ignore Claire's requests during the final race and thoroughly piss her off. Again, something I summarize in full during the Terrible Decisions video. So whether it's Beast or Sahara that you personally prefer, both are toughened up, easy to obtain choices for any vehicle combat where we want to use our own guns. Thorton Colby's little mule has come a very long way from what was a wholesome family car. With a souped-up engine, crystal dome windows, and mounted machine guns for extra protection, this is recognizable as a Colby in name and general shape only. Frequently used in nomad convoys for its reliability and to protect trucks holding the heavy cargo. Are there better nomad protection vehicles out there? Yes, significantly so. For starters, the gun placement on this one makes for pretty inaccurate fire when engaged in combat, and couple that with the okay but not tremendously great acceleration, and that means we can't zip around landing shots with perfect precision and speed. That said, if you've a mind to drive across NC with a 5-star wanted level, you'll no doubt burn through many of the weaponized vehicles, and will therefore need a fair few in backup. So at just 41k, this one isn't a bad choice to add to that list of summons. Another of the bikes we can own, the Arch Nazare, is the basic mid-tier model of the 3 mains we can choose from. Matching the mid-tier sports car in speed and acceleration, it's a step up from the Apollo both in power and in price. For a steep 71,000 eddies, it's weirdly more expensive than the bike in the game which will get very high up this list. And perhaps the markup in price is less down to raw stats and more down simply to owning a label. Alongside the Porsche, Arch motorcycles are one of the few vehicles you could theoretically own in-game and in real life. The company was founded back in 2011 by 2 tunes named Gard Hollinger and Keanu Reeves, the latter of whom bears a striking resemblance to Ted from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, or Neo from The Matrix, or John Wick. Not quite sure what the guy's bikes are doing in Cyberpunk though. Comment down below if you know. Sadly, it doesn't seem like Johnny spawning in extends to motorcycles either, else we could have actually had Silverhand sitting on the back of one of these bikes that he obviously has nothing to do with. This is one of the 6 Nazare models we can own in the game, and it is the 2nd most expensive of the bunch. The bright yellow though looks awesome during the day and goes especially nicely with David's jackets, and maybe something more blue as well to complement the light up blue wheels, which can be activated on the keyboard by pressing V. The second most variant-heavy Quadra sports car is the Phantom Liberty exclusive Sport R7, with 4 different models which each vary a little in stats and design, albeit less so now that they all share the same unique twin-tone designs. Bottom of this pile then is the Sterling, a reference first and foremost to Archer, and awarded by Mr. Hands as a little thank you for completing all of his gigs. The front and center fixer of the Spy Thriller expansion, gifting us with a spy-themed car. The model and colour specifically picked by Hands himself to be nothing too flashy, though we can of course change that now to look however we want. Out of all the R7s though, the Sterling is unfortunately slightly slower, maybe tying with the Chiron, though that one has its own unique feature as well. But if you want a Sport R7 with a big spoiler and no exposed engine, then this is the one to go for. The vehicle ranking highest on this list, exclusively on its toughness and weaponry, and not at all on its speed, is the closest thing to a tank, without actually being a tank, that we can own and deploy whenever. It's also the most expensive vehicle, possibly the most expensive singular thing one can buy in Cyberpunk. Militech's Hellhound is the heavy-duty vehicle deployed by police to any level 4 crime scene, piling towards you with hefty cannon fire as you swiftly leap over and away, generally mean, that's what I do. Fighting from inside one of these things, though, is a somewhat different story. With its unpoppable tires and very tough resistance to gunfire, it is definitely something you want to summon into a crime scene when you're hoping to escalate rather than escape the situation, easily surviving behind its toughened up shell right up to a 5-star wanted level. Though, unfortunately, upon hitting that point, the Hellhound offers little bolstered resilience to Netwatch, and they'll still disable the vehicle all the same, leaving you scrambling for another one or just air dashing away. And so long as that mechanic exists at 5 stars, the Hellhound will always have less utility than it otherwise could. Still, if you have the eddies to burn and want the greatest security measure just hanging around in your back pocket, there's few things that are going to beat the Hellhound's armor and weapons. However, if you're wanting to survive combat and eventually escape it quickly, then there are still significantly better options, more akin to the little mule say, but better. Another Arch Nazare model now. The 68K Nazare Kobold shares the design of a cool-looking demonic face on the front with a couple of other Nazare variants. Problem being that the other two are both obtainable without spending a penny, whereas this one requires somewhat deep pockets. The one reason to buy it really, the literal only difference aside from the slightly different weight, is the very pinkish vibe of this model. Pink paint, pink light-up wheels, and a secondary light blue to complement it all. Perfect, of course, if that's the look that your Via's going for, wielding cocktail stick and maybe Lizzie from atop it. But for everybody else, it's a very expensive, albeit slightly different version of something you can already obtain. The next of the Sport R7s is the Charon, the fancy-looking sports car specifically hired by the Cassell twins to get around Dogtown and NC during their brief visit. Crucial, of course, to the Phantom Liberty storyline, so we won't actually be able to obtain it until reaching near to the end of that, wherein the moving heat quest will trigger, and we'll be guided by a netrunner into Barghest's parking garage to steal the car back. Not to return to the Charon Exotics company, but more conveniently to keep for ourselves. And whilst the Charon sports more or less the same stats as the Sterling, maybe a little extra speed, it's well worth obtaining in its own right due to its very unique feature. The bonnet, when reaching high speeds, will light up with a holographic display of flames. One of the coolest looking effects we can have on any vehicle, and which, as of 2.2, can also be paired up with whatever Crystal Coat twin tone theme we choose. The R7s tend to have these racing stripes going on in their unique skins, giving this awesome trail effect along the full length of the car. The very best new vehicle added in 2.2 in my opinion is the Mizutani Shion MZ1. Basically a convertible version of the MZ2 which matches its stats pretty much point for point. 170 top speed, 0 to 60 in 4 and 0 to 120 in 12 seconds, give or take. There's also actually no twin tone on this model, possibly because it's convertible. But even despite that, I would argue that the blue tones of the car are cool enough to look at that it doesn't matter. And in some ways maintain a certain uniqueness to it. So respected, in fact, is this car that when the previous owner, an Arasaka Corpo, was flatlined when inside by a group of Valentinos, they didn't dare plant a single scratch on the car itself, leaving it in prime condition for Reyes to auction off to us at a fairly steep 61k. But given it's the best new thing we can own in the game in over a year, and it's a bit more of a departure from just the reskins and stat tweaks that all the other vehicles were, I'd say that this, above all, is the new car most worth owning. It's also, given its convertible nature, much easier to see out of in first person than the MZ2, so personally, I'm a big fan. Another variant of the Arch Nazare Kobold is the Phantom Liberty exclusive Melina Mobile, a bike that can only potentially be obtained during the Dazed and Confused quest, depending on how we choose to resolve that. But don't worry if you missed it, because there's an almost identical version coming up shortly. Though I'll explain quickly how to get this one, so jump to the next timestamp to avoid spoilers for that quest. After arriving at the studio with Lena Melina present, we'll have 3 options to choose from regarding the fates of Paul, poor brain-addled tool who thinks he is Lina Melina. The kindest thing to do would be to wake him up from his trance and return him to his normal self. But if we'd rather a free bike, we can instead convince him that he's actually Lina Melina's secret sister. This interaction, which he believes, immediately becomes a BD hit, propelling Lina and to Lina to newfound fame and leaving Tool's mind disturbingly trapped forever. But as thanks, Lina will leave behind her baseball bat and a few days later this bike, before explaining that the two of them are getting signed by Fourth Wall Studios, the same guys behind the Joshua Stevenson quests. Now, I really wouldn't say that I particularly like the color orange. In real life, it's probably one of my least favorite colors, and I'm quite sure I'd never buy a car in it. Yet, in Cyberpunk 2077, I can't help but irrationally love the Quartz Bandit, partially due to the general beauty of its design, of course, but no doubt also because of the bright orange color. And if it weren't for the immense amount of soul this thing exudes, then no doubt it would be ranking lower, purely on its own stats. With just 150 as its top speed, the only place it really shines is its incredible acceleration of just 3 seconds, thanks to its horsepower. Yet, that too will be dethroned by the weaponized Quartzes higher up. Still, none of them quite have the same level of character as the Bandits, which is easily worth the 69,000 eddies in my opinion, but if you prefer, you can simply refuse to help Pan Am take out Nash in Rocky Ridge, and later on, after the Ghost Town quest, Rogue will award us with the car for free, for sticking strictly to the job. The Arch-Nazare Itsumade is by far the easiest to obtain variant of the Kobold bike if you know where to look. Inside a hidden garage near the Ripperdock in Santo Domingo, we can trigger a hidden quest involving a nomad girl and her cowardly, traitorous boyfriend. Josie Alcazar stole this bike from some tiger claws after they destroyed her one, stashing the Itsumade next to All Foods. Now, I don't want to spoil the entire story of what happens here, but basically during the quest, we'll learn that this couple, Josie and her boyfriend's anniversary is the 14th of February. Romantic, but also an important code though, as it's the one Josie locked the stolen Itsumade behind, believing it only to be known by James, her boyfriend. So, when heading to the garage ourselves at the end of the quest and inputting said code, we will obtain, completely for free, this turquoise-tinted variant with the same demonic faceplate. No mass sums of money, nor questionable moral decisions needed. Very almost the height of how good the Thorton Galena can actually become, the Galena Gecko, like the Colby Little Mule, is a massively buffed up nomad variant with insane boosts to its horsepower to take a car previously with a 9-second 0 to 60 down to just 3, though it does taper off somewhat after that, making for an okay 13-second 0 to 120. Where the Gecko really shines though is in the positioning of its front-mounted guns, both very close together, allowing us to train both guns on a single enemy, whereas before we'd generally be wasting half our bullets. Not necessarily as accurate as just firing with our own guns, but requiring a lot less mental effort, so we can basically focus on driving and just positioning the car on what's directly in front of us. Something which again is far easier in the Gecko, given its smaller size and better niftiness in tight corners, all wrapped up for just 45k to make it a special deal indeed. The fastest model of the 3 core bikes in the game is the Yaiba Kusanagi, for which there are 3 different variants we can own as of 2.1, with the least exciting for me being the Akashita, a newer model costing 72k but being far less aesthetically appealing than the original, with a high-up backrest which may look comfy for V but isn't quite as cool a design as the upcoming CT3X or even the Peacekeeper. Still, if we go back to that pink cocktail stick wielding build that I recommended for the standard Kobold, you may do well to employ that with this bike too, though this one is possibly more of a red and green vibe and wouldn't fit that quite as well. Akashita also means a monster that hides behind dark clouds, apparently. The absolute best variant of the Thorton Colby is also the older cousin to the Little Mule. The Vulture improves on that design in several ways with slightly better speed and acceleration, though more importantly, given it's mostly a combat car, the addition of missiles and far closer together front-mounted turrets, much more similar to the Galena Gecko for far better accuracy. Though missiles themselves aren't as great as you'd expect on these things. They do target stuff, but only tend to fire in that general vicinity. bad, seeing as how they're just as effective fired from this as they are from the vastly more expensive Trailbruiser or Hellhound, maybe save your eddies on those and just fork out on this or the Locust as your heavy combat car. Unless, like me of course, you're planning to burn through them one after the other on some mega police chase. Then just buy up as many combat vehicles as you can. If you're a first-person driver though, then visibility isn't great here. The Galenas on the whole for that are much better. Back to another of the bikes though, and the most expensive Arch Nazare model just so happens to be one of the best in my opinion. The Nazare Racer is basically just a dark/black variant of the yellow Nazare from earlier, but it looks hella cool at night, especially with its light up red rims. You'll definitely want to pair this with some darker clothing, maybe even a Max Tag uniform, then drive around wielding a Ratter, which matches the bike's glow almost perfectly. It's also apparently got a carbon fiber chassis, which should technically make it a little faster, but that's not really noticeable, and personally I'm ranking it this high on vibe alone. Stats-wise, it's more or less the same as the other Arches. Alright, we've gone around a bit now with a bunch of very similar Nomad vehicles. The Galena Locust is another of those, and going by Rhea's description, you'd expect it to be vastly better than the Gecko. In reality, it beats it by a tiny margin, and that's mostly on account of simply having missiles. The mounted turrets are actually wider apart, a mark down if you ask me, but otherwise the two are more or less identical. Except this one is 15,000 eddies more, and it has slightly less eye-catching colours. Again, given how these will probably be used though, having both in your virtual garage isn't a bad idea. In contrast to the Galena Locust, the Mizutani Shion Samum is the rocketed equivalent of the Shion Coyote, but aside from that is worse in every single way. It's 10k more expensive, 20 mph slower, and accelerates slower too. Still perfectly pleasant to get around the Badlands in, these Shion variants have always been great to drive off-road, but there's still faster cars out there, including even another rocketed one. So again, just another fine but expensive addition to our growing selection of heavily weaponized cars. This one may also be a Witcher reference though, nodding towards the Samum bomb used to destroy nests of monsters, or in this case, nests of wraiths or Militech. My second favourite design for the Kusanagi bike now is the very blue-themed Peacekeeper model. It's also the lightest weight-wise of its class, meaning technically it should be a little faster, but that's not really noticeable, so I'm gonna go by design. Gone is the huge backrest of the Akashita, creating something much more sleek-looking, though still not nearly as much as the upcoming Akira bike. So it's my second choice out of the fastest bikes in the game to use in a pinch should the CT3X get blown up or fall into the sea. Or if you're sporting a lot of blue in your build, this variant might be especially worth the 75,000 eddy price tag. Okay, Scorpion's Apollo is technically, in almost every single way, worse in stats than many other bikes lower on the list. So why am I ranking it so high? Well, firstly, Scorpion's Apollo will naturally become ours as we progress the main storyline. When Pan Am decides we should be the one to inherit it from Scorpion during life during wartime, despite the fact that we only met the guy once, and it's technically through our actions that the man met his death soon thereafter. Even still, there's no need for special side quests or even spending cash to get it. Second, whilst the Apollo variants have significantly lower top speeds than the other two, that matters a lot less when traversing the bumpy off-road hills of the Badlands, a place that everyone should thoroughly explore at some point in their playthrough for the many Easter eggs and namely secret underground bunkers found out here. Scorpion's Apollo is especially designed for off-road traversal, having been an Aldecaldo bike, and pairing it with the hand cannon jump technique especially can get you around every obstacle in the Badlands with absolutely no bother. Much as I love the Quartz Bandit car, it's tough to deny that its Nomad-tuned variants beat it in every way. Save for the design, the Bandit's got that one. But with just a 2.5 second 0 to 60 and 8.5 second 0 to 120, the Archer Quartz Spectre is one of the absolute speediest cars of the entire game, though the speed does taper down pretty quickly after that before topping out at 160, and there's still plenty of cars that outpace it at those higher speeds. But realistically, Honestly, Night City isn't just a straight bit of road anyway. With all the stops, corners, and turns required during a general driving session, acceleration and handling are arguably even more important. The Spectre nails the first one, as we've seen, and handles pretty well too. Though that's a harder stat to definitively quantify, so let's just say I didn't find it particularly difficult to handle. Throw in the rear-mounted guns, and this makes for one of the best combat vehicles in the game too. Nifty, though because of the wider gun placement not as accurate as some of the others. In fact, sometimes I feel like the precision of just shooting out the windows with our own guns can actually be easier than mounted weaponry. Not quite as cool looking though, and if you're a first-person driver, this has definitely got one of the better visibility levels, though not quite the best. The Quadra Sport R7 Vigilante is undoubtedly one of the best Quadras, but even more so to those who pre-ordered Phantom Liberty back in 2023, since they can receive this car for free, having won a lottery that V never entered, as opposed to having to fork out $86k, a very steep price and more even than what is arguably the best Sport R7. Mind you, that is an even closer contest nowadays, thanks to the inclusion of the same twin tones for all the R7s. Both the Vigilante and Chiaroscuro have this exposed front engine, with the only difference being that the Vigilante lacks the large spoiler, also seen earlier on Hand's R7 Sterling. There's also a slight difference stats-wise between the two, at least there was in my testing, with the Vigilante having slightly better acceleration and Chiaroscuro greater top speed. Though if you didn't pre-order Phantom Liberty and have to therefore purchase both, I'd say buy up the other one before this one. A really special addition to the cars which made its debut in 2.1, the Porsche 911 Cabriolet sits alongside Johnny's Porsche as a more stylized, not to mention convertible, alternative. It shares all the same stats as Johnny's original, 150 top speed, 4 second 0 to 60, etc., but does have a slightly higher weight than Johnny's. And as many pointed out in an old video, this is due to convertible cars actually needing a more heavily reinforced lower chassis to compensate for the lack of welded roof. Lovely little attention to detail there. Same as everything about this car, in fact. See, the Cabriolet isn't simply a quick auto-fixer purchase and done, it actually has a tragic little side quest tied to it. See, Johnny Silverman was the biggest Johnny Silverhand wannabe who ever did live, but after recently developing a new obsession with us cracks, Silverman headed to a deal that meant he ever did die. Waiting for us to come and pick up the vehicle, Silverman was killed and his car stolen by wraiths. They were planning to respray the thing in the colors of their souls, dirt and grey, but fortunately V comes along to save this masterpiece before they can lay a scratch on it. And everything from the black and yellow color scheme, the samurai decals, the X's on the lights, makes me actually glad that Porsches don't have twin tone. Just enjoy the car for what it is. The other half of the Sport R7 Vigilante, and the better half in my opinion, is the darker coloured Chiaroscuro. In the canon, both cars were the final work of a designer named Georgia Barbaris, with this being her first submission to the boards. Though with their corpo focus on wealth and appealing to the masses, they rejected the thing as too grim, brooding and extreme. So she then took away the spoiler, painted it in more of a red, and re-released it as the Vigilante, which they immediately fell in love with at first sight. Crazy how opinions can change after just a simple tiny retexture. Even more funnily now though, thanks to Crystal Coat Twin Tone, none of that even has to matter anymore, with the only discernible visual difference at that point being the Chiaroscuro's spoiler. And personally, I think that gives the car just a bit more character, hence the higher ranking, with the untwin-toned variants of this one also reminding me heavily of Robert Pattinson's Batmobile, though again, any of the Sport R7s can fill that role now, thanks to twin tone. It's kind of insane how many good cars in the game there actually are when you compile them into a single ranking video, as it means top cars like the Shion Coyote still wind up a ways further back here. Though don't by any means dismiss this one. It is still one of the fastest, most heavily armoured Badlands-equipped vehicles, with the same brilliant off-road suspension as its rocketed Samum variants, but a much greater top speed. Also, Coyote's guns are on the front and fairly close together, making them far more accurate at close range and good for blasting through roadblocks or assaulting military bases. Just don't expect to survive any full fight in this thing. It's got nicely reinforced tires and a little bit of armor, but doesn't quite beat the Hellhound or even its upcoming Quadra competitors. Still, at $77k, it remains a cool-looking, springy Badlands favorite of mine. With 777 horsepower, the Quadra Type-66 Avenger is the most powerful civilian Type-66 in the game. And by that, I mean it's the best unarmored model without the crystal dome protection and still featuring crystal coats. With a top speed of 185, only surpassed, I think, by the Rayfields, we can actually compare acceleration at 3 different points with this one. With a 3 second 0 to 60, 10 second 0 to 120, and 22 second 0 to 180, there really are few things that can beat this car across the board. And if you genuinely do prefer to use your own guns over, say, mounted weapons, then you should definitely take this one out for spins over the upcoming marginally faster entries. But with that said, this car still comes with a couple caveats. Interior visibility suffers from the same limitations as the rest of the Quadras, but the Avenger especially doesn't fall into the same grouping for unique crystal coat twin tones. All the other models are technically variants of the 640 and 680, with the Avenger being then incredibly unique. I roamed around Night City for a good long while trying to find Avengers whose twin tones I could steal, but to no avail. Sure, we can still program in our own more basic designs, but it's not quite the same. So let me know in the comments if you found any unique twin tones specifically for the Avengers, and if so, then where? At 99,000 eddies, the souped-up Badlands variant of the Quadra 66, the Javelina, is listed at that price for good reason. Even still, it may be one of the models with which to spend your auto-fixer coupons on. With a matching top speed to the 66 Avenger, the Javelina first overtakes it slightly at all 3 levels of acceleration, but where it really wins out is in its souped-up Badlands armor plating, granting it very reinforced tires and decent resistance to bullets, though not so much explosions, so still be careful of those. Also, in case you were wondering where to find the interior speedometer in this, it's this tiny little number on the steering wheel. I spent quite a while looking for it myself. The Javelina does also have the drawback of no twin tone features though, leaving you stuck with its golden aesthetic. Not the prettiest car to look at overall, though the roaring exhausts at least are kind of cool. The second fastest car in the game in terms of raw top speed is the first and most expensive of the Rayfield vehicles. In fact, it's the second most expensive thing in the game after the Hellhound, and only owned by a very select few across Night City, including Kerry Eurodyne. Our model though, the Rayfield Arendite Guinevere, was previously owned by the Argentinian ambassador, whom Reyes kindly sold it off for after the guy fled Night City when his country returned to martial law. According to the description, it fetches a heftier price tag than the average earnings of a Night citizen, multiplied by 52, making said average lifetime earnings a measly €2,981. Maybe it fetches a heftier price tag off the factory floor, and maybe also gameplay mechanics dictate it can't sell for the ridiculous millions it canonically would, as most players would struggle to raise the funds for it. Even still, it's proof that this is probably the ultimate status symbol one can own in Night City, and that's before we even get started on stats. Slightly slower in acceleration than the Avenger and Javelina, especially initially, Arendite overtakes them slightly in terms of raw top speed, hitting 188. It's also very toughened up to gunfire and explosions, but does suffer with something of a combat caveat that it shares with the Caliburn. Being unable to shoot through the Crystal Dome front windscreen means that we have a huge no-fire zone at the front, the opposite problem to cars with mounted guns, but only really noticeable if shooting directly ahead, at a roadblock say. Arendite also has plenty of twin-tone retextures of its own, making for a much more varied ride now. And if the name Arendite sounds familiar for some reason, then you may recognize it from the Witcher games, it being not only the best silver sword in The Witcher 3, gifted by the Lady of the Lake, but also The Witcher 1 as well. Another car with a hell of a lot of character now, the Quadra Turbo RV-Tech secures this spot largely on its canonicity. With the inclusion of the Witcher bobblehead on the front dash, same as the Archer Hella and Thorton Galena Rattler for Nomads, this is clearly a car that V comes to own in the canon story, and is probably what they end up driving by the end. It was also seen across many of the posters and trailers for the game several years ago. And not only is it a fair bit faster than the standard Turbo R, especially in terms of acceleration, but it looks, and more importantly sounds, a lot cooler too. Sharing the same Ferrari-type style as its basic model, this variant was souped up by the engineer Jake Estevez after we saved his car from some gangers for the Haywood gig life's work. Go check out my Haywood gigs video, as there's a really cool story behind this gig. Anyway, a few days later, after helping Jake, he'll gift us this awesome looking car as thanks. And sure, a top speed of 165 isn't quite comparable to some of the other, even lower entries, but again, it's not all about speed here. And without conducting these rigorous tests on every single car in the game, you probably won't even notice that this one is slower. You will, however, notice if you end up completing the game having not unlocked this most canon and popular of vehicles. If we're talking popularity contest though, then something even more iconic would be Johnny's Porsche 911 Turbo, the oldest car within the canon of the game, aged to 100 by 2077, but still running like an absolute dream. It is of course obtained during the chip-in inquest at the Ebonique, but can be potentially missed if you don't know where to look. Simply hop up to this platform at the edge of the ship and push this button though, and you should be all good, getting probably the most awesome reveal of any car in the game.
My ride. Hop in. I'll even let you drive.
So popular was Johnny's Porsche back in the day, in fact, that Rogue will remember it very vividly too.
This Johnny's Porsche?
Safe to say that a lot of love has been put into this car in more ways than one. And on the passenger dashboard, we can even see the signature of lead vehicle artist Jakub Przyspolowski. And yes, it may not be the fastest or the best available when we look at its stats, but it's a Porsche 911 for crying out loud. And as the original of the two that we can own in the game, it secures its place in the top 10. Scoring major points for some of the best handling, and possibly the best first-person view of any car in the game now, is the standard Herrera Outlaw, a car which responds so instantaneously to driver inputs that it even moves off completely effortlessly, no wheel spin or anything. And whilst the pinkish rear grille is lovely to look at, not to mention the wide selection of unique twin tones or your own custom one, this really is one of my top choices for driving in first person. Aside from a little dashboard at the base of the screen, the view ahead is very clear in this thing. It's also fairly reliable with cornering and weaving through traffic, as well as acceleration should we need to stop for some reason, making it one of the smoothest and most pleasant rides to enjoy in full first-person cinematic view, or just the standard third. Beaten only on that front by its equally speedy, albeit decked out with guns, weaponized version coming up in a bit. But in fairness, seeing as that one lacks twin tone, this one has the most custom features. If you desperately want a weaponized car with both missiles and machine guns, then the very best choice in this game is the Archer Quartz Sidewinder. Basically just the Spectre from earlier on, with slightly worse gun placement, an unchangeable green paint job in place of silver, and again, the addition of rockets. Plus an 11k Dira, price tag of 90,000, and I suppose Phantom Liberty exclusivity. Worth owning, in this case, over the Spectre, since we don't really lose anything by gaining the rockets this time, plus given the car's insane acceleration, you'll be best off using it to escape pursuers, with the rockets probably best used anyway when fired backwards to shake off cops, Militech if you're in the Badlands, or the occasional gang attack. So if you're going to buy just one car with missiles, then the Sidewinder, even in 2.2, is still the one to get. The Quadra Type-66 Hoon may not match the Javelina in its top speed, but sits higher up the list for two special reasons. Firstly, the car is free and one of the easiest to obtain in the entire game, though it only spawns after Act 1 and the heist. After doing that, head to this warehouse up in Northside and find the keys in a container stashed nearby. Then, just like that, the Hoon is yours. Not quite matching the horsepower of the Javelina, hence perhaps the docked speed, but still with the same general design, tough toughness, and of course guns, which usefully are placed more on the center front, though the specific decals and paintwork of the car are a direct tribute to Ken Block's Hoonicorn, the famous rally driver and YouTube star who sadly passed away in January 2023, several months before the release of 2.0 and Phantom Liberty. The 43 largely displayed across the car was his rally number, and his initials too can be seen on the side. A wonderful car and one of the best, most iconic in the entire game that's totally worth making a beeline for at the start of Act 2. But with a similar, characterful design to the Hoon, albeit matching its stats perfectly with the Javelina, the Type 66 Wingate is still, I would say, the best of its kind in the game. Not quite as sentimentally valuable as the Hoon itself, of course, and setting us back another massive 99k at full price, but there's no arguing with an additional 20 mile an hour to the top speed, which it can fully reach in just over 20 seconds. The placement of guns on the Hoon is also better, admittedly, but given the Wingate are on the back of the car, bullets spread a little less widely than on the Javelina. So, in a toss-up between those two, provided you have Phantom Liberty, which this car is exclusive to, I'd say this is the better choice. Just about. Showing just how close the race is between all the cars up here, in the top 15, 20, maybe even 30 of the list, coming largely down to personal preference and individual scenarios. That said, I am pretty happy with the placements of the upcoming top 5. Did you ever hear the tragedy of Jackie Wells, the Ambitious? I thought not. It isn't a story the corpos would tell you. It's a street kid legend. Jackie Wells was an ex-Valentino from Haywood, so new to the afterlife and so eager that he was influenced by Dexter DeShawn to steal a biochip. His girlfriend had such knowledge of tarot cards that she thought she could keep the man she cared about from dying. The major arcana are the pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. Jackie became so confident, the only thing he was afraid of was not becoming a legend, which eventually, of course, he did. Unfortunately, his girlfriend told him to avoid mean reds. Then he bought a red Arch Nazare. It's ironic. He could help others enjoy his bike, but not himself. Jackie's Arch is sentimentally one of the best bikes in the game, received free after either completing Heroes or simply being gifted it by his mother as an inheritance of sorts. It's foreshadowing, I guess, as to how Jackie's ambition and disregard for warnings resulted in his death. But by driving it, we get to constantly pay tribute to the Tomb who couldn't join us in the major leagues. Statistically, no better than the other Arch motorcycles, but if you're not driving this one like 90% of the time, then that's outrageous. It's unfair. How can you own Jackie's Arch and not constantly drive it? Herrera cars are really getting prime placements on this list, and for very good reason. Whilst I love the standard Outlaw, and always have, the Herrera Riptide Terrier beats it in almost every way. With a slightly higher top speed of 185, albeit very similar acceleration times, where the Terrier wins out is more in its futuristic yet kind of retro design, where, instead of opening side doors to get inside like pretty much every other car, the entire front of it pops up for V to jump in. Yet, unlike the Rayfield vehicles, this causes absolutely no problems in combat. We still have the 360-degree shooting radius. Good thing too, given this is one of the vehicles I drive around Night City the most in, and thus still get into a fair bit of combat. The first-person view, as well, just like the Outlaw, is great, aside from this small color tint, which may be off-putting to some. The shape, in general, sits somewhere between Back to the Future's DeLorean and a Ferrari, making it one of the nicest designs in the game in my opinion. Though it also costs a very dear 108,000 eddies and only unlocks after completing a lot of Radiant car missions for Reyes. One of the steepest prices in the game, especially when we factor in the time we need to spend stealing other cars too. Would it ease that pain if I told you that canonically only 10 Terrier variants of the standard Riptide GT2 ever existed? Well, what if I told you that it also has plenty of awesome unique twin-tone designs still to be found around Night City? Would you want to buy it then? The best of all the bikes in the game, still in my opinion, is the original Yaiba Kusanagi CT3X, aka the Akira bike, with the iconic sleek red design being unmissably reminiscent of that movie. And whilst the name Akira would go to a boss featured during the second Johnny flashback, the name Kusanagi is another reference instead to the protagonist of Ghost in the Shell. A hell of a lot of Cyberpunk crammed into one bike, making it also the most stylishly fitting of them all in the game. Though, until you've amassed the spare 66,000 eddies for it, you'll want to stick to Jackie's Arch, which comes incredibly close to this one in both sentimentality and stats. This may win on the stat and style fronts, and it's also a vibrant mean red, but it's not quite the ride of our fallen Tumba. So let's instead call this one the best bike that feels entirely like it's just V's. The Caliburn, of course, sits in the top 2, and is that really any surprise? For many of you, it will be number 1 though, on account of being the speediest car in the game by quite a margin. The top 210 miles an hour sits leagues ahead of the Arendite Guinevere's 188, though its acceleration to 180 is matched by the likes of the Wingate, taking just 20 seconds to get there. Even still, if I simply need a car and want to get somewhere quickly, my natural instinct is still to summon the Caliburn, and I'll bet yours is too. Admittedly though, this may be partially due to the fact that one of the two models is obtainable absolutely free, from down in the Badlands Tunnel near Rocky Ridge. The ongoing mystery of what exactly happened to Merkman will probably keep us scratching our heads until at least Orion, but that's only because we all ought to make a beeline for his iconic Batmobile-inspired car. So useful in fact that for a long time, there was little reason to fork out the 135k on the white and gold Caliburn in Gold Beach Marina. Though, ever since twin tones were introduced to the Rayfields, the devs did make sure that Merkman had disabled that feature on his model before he disappeared. Can't of course have some Night City gonk turning his Merkmobile into a Melina-mobile or something. So, if you do want the fastest car to also change colour, you'll have to fork out an additional 135k. Definitely worth it if, like so many, you plan to always grab the fastest possible vehicle and go, since you can then enjoy it however you specifically want. Though if you've learned one thing from this video, then I hope it's to go and give some of the other cars and bikes a try. There's so much versatility in this game and so many wonderful references to other media, even in just the cars, and the only problem that the Caliburn does have is when we use it in combat, since, like with Arendite, it's impossible to shoot directly ahead, though it's still not at all terrible at mowing foes down, provided there's no obstacles in the way. But this does lead us on to the Herrera Outlaw Whaler. Despite not being the fastest nor the most heavy duty, I would say is best in the whole game on account of how it functions all round. Let's start with obtaining it. This thing becomes available after completing several car theft missions for El Capitan before unlocking the quest Baby Let Me Take You. A soft conclusion to his storyline whereby we clep a lorry of medical goods to return to the sick children of Santo Domingo. And after that morning of wholesomeness, El Capitan thanks us with the closest thing to a James Bond car we can own. The Whaler has identical stats to the already highly appraised Herrera Outlaw, but now with the addition of unpoppable tires and increased vehicle toughness all round. Factor that in with the front-mounted machine guns, which are very close together, and you probably have the most effective combat vehicle in the game. Sure, it won't last forever in a fight, but nor will anything else, and you can rest easy knowing your tires at least won't burst when it's time to run away. It also wins on the first-person view front with the exact same one as the basic Outlaw. In fairness, the Caliburn wasn't bad either, but did have some more distracting lines in the crystal dome windows. Outlaws give a perfectly clear view. And again, on flat terrain, a Caliburn would win in a drag race. In fact, several cars would beat this one there. But around the narrow streets and tight corners of Night City, the superior handling of the Outlaw is gonna be to your major advantage. So, whilst it may be a little subjective depending on the situation, on balance, I would say the Outlaw Whaler is the best vehicle in Cyberpunk 2077. Unless you want to do fancy jumps, then it's the Kusanagi. Or you want raw speed, then it's the Caliburn. Or just want to explore off-road, then it's maybe the Wingate or Scorpion's Apollo. Look, the point is, there's no one vehicle fits all in Cyberpunk 2077, and that's a wonderful thing. So go forth, samurai, build a legion of vehicles, and drive the streets of Night City as I have. Also, go check out Factor, who I'd like to again thank for sponsoring today's video, that's linked down below. And thank you, as always, to the wonderful patrons who allow me to be more selective with which sponsors I take and only promote brands I feel are genuinely relevant and beneficial to you guys. Thank you for watching the longest car ranking, probably longest Cyberpunk video I've ever made. I'm Sam Bram, and have a Nova Day. Tooms.